The autumn of 1952 in Brooklyn's Lower East Side was painted in shades of brown and gray, where hope seemed as scarce as clean water. Alma Bronstein had known this neighborhood her entire life, every cracked sidewalk, every rust-stained fire escape, every face that had watched her grow from a shy girl into a woman who dared to speak truth. She worked as a seamstress in Goldberg's shop on Hester Street, her fingers dancing across fabric with the precision of a surgeon. But Alma's real gift wasn't in mending clothes. It was in seeing patterns others missed. When young Sarah Goldstein came to work with bruises shaped like fingerprints, Alma noticed. When Mrs. Kowalski's rent mysteriously doubled overnight, Alma connected the dots. When 3 different families suddenly decided to move after refusing to pay protection money, Alma understood. Inspector Clay Crowley owned this neighborhood in ways that went far beyond his badge. He was a mountain of a man with dead eyes and hands that had never known honest work. The police station on Rivington Street might have been his office, but the real business happened in back alleys and basement meetings where fear was currency and silence was survival. Alma had been gathering evidence for months, names, dates, amounts. She documented everything in a small notebook hidden beneath her sewing machine. The pattern was clear. Crowley wasn't just corrupt, he was destroying lives with systematic precision. But in 1952, who would believe a Jewish seamstress over an Irish cop with 20 years on the force? The day she decided to act, October 15th, the leaves were falling like dying dreams. Alma walked into the police station with her notebook clutched against her chest like armor. She asked to speak with someone about Inspector Crowley. The desk sergeant, a young man with kind eyes named Murphy, listened to her for exactly 7 minutes before his face went pale. "Miss, you need to leave. Now." But it was too late. Crowley had been watching from the doorway, his smile sharp as broken glass. Within an hour, the word had spread through the neighborhood like poison in water. Alma Bronstein was a troublemaker, a liar, a woman who had thrown herself at the good inspector and then cried assault when he rejected her advances. The whispers followed her home, seeping through thin walls and closed doors. "She's always been different, that one. Too bold for her own good." What did she expect, making accusations like that? The next morning, they came for her. Part 2. The branding, 3,500 characters. They dragged her from her tenement apartment at dawn, when the streets were empty except for milk wagons and street sweepers. Alma fought, her nails drew blood from Officer Kowalski's cheek. Her teeth found Murphy's hand when he tried to silence her screams. But there were 4 of them, and she was just one woman whose crime was believing that truth mattered more than power. They brought her to the alley behind the police station, where a small crowd had already gathered. Word traveled fast in neighborhoods where entertainment was scarce and cruelty was free. Mrs. Goldberg stood in her doorway, wringing her hands but saying nothing. The baker, Mr. Rosenstein, watched from his window but quickly pulled the curtains closed when Crowley's eyes found his. "Alma Bronstein," Crowley's voice carried across the narrow space like a judge pronouncing sentence, "has been spreading lies about good men, about men who serve this community with honor and dedication." He held up her notebook, the pages fluttering in the morning breeze like dying butterflies. "These are the ravings of a woman who has lost touch with decency, with truth, with her proper place." The brazier had been heating for an hour. The iron glowed orange-red, shaped like the letter L, for liar. Later, people would say they smelled the metal heating from 3 blocks away. But nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just watched. "This is what happens," Crowley continued, his voice calm as Sunday morning prayers. "When people forget the natural order of things, when they forget that some truths are too dangerous for simple minds to handle." Alma's dress was torn, her hair wild with struggle, but her eyes burned with something fiercer than the iron waiting for her flesh. When they forced her to her knees, she spat at Crowley's feet. "The only liar here is you," she said, voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "And everyone knows it. They're just too afraid to say so." The crowd murmured, not in agreement, not in disagreement, but in that uncomfortable way people do when they hear truth they're not ready to acknowledge. Crowley took the iron himself. The hiss of flesh meeting metal was lost beneath Alma's scream, but the smell, burnt skin and terror and shame, lingered in the alley long after the crowd dispersed. The mark was precise, deliberate. A seared L on her left cheek, just deep enough to never fade. As she collapsed forward, gasping, Crowley leaned down to whisper in her ear, "Now everyone will know what you are, and if you ever speak my name again, I'll do worse than mark you." They left her there, bleeding into the dirt, as the neighborhood slowly, silently, returned to their morning routines. Mrs. Goldberg brought water, but from a distance, setting it down and backing away as if shame were contagious. Young Sarah Goldstein started toward her, but her mother pulled her back with sharp words, "Don't get involved. We can't afford to get involved." By evening, Alma had dragged herself to her feet and stumbled home. By midnight, she'd packed what little she owned into a cloth sack. By dawn, she was walking east toward the river, the branded L on her cheek raw and weeping, her shadow long behind her like everything she was leaving behind. Part 3. Found in the Darkness, 3,500 characters. The old Paramount Theater on East River Drive had been closed for 3 years, its marquee dark, its dreams reduced to peeling paint and broken promises. But in the basement, where the heating pipes created a maze of warm corners and the stage lights had once cast magic, life persisted in the shadows. Rook Walker had made this forgotten place his home not by choice, but by necessity. A black man in 1952 Brooklyn had limited options, especially one whose war medals meant nothing to landlords and whose nightmares kept him awake until dawn. The theater basement was dry, warm, and most importantly, invisible to the world above that had no use for him. He wasn't alone. 3 children had found their way to him over the past 2 years, or perhaps he'd found them. Mina, 8 years old, whose mother had died of tuberculosis and whose father had simply disappeared one day, leaving her to fend for herself on streets that devoured the vulnerable. Tommy, 12, whose parents had been deported back to Ireland, leaving him with nothing but his accent and his anger. And little Rosa, barely 6, who spoke only Spanish and had never told them where she'd come from or how she'd learned to pick locks with the skill of a seasoned thief. They were his family now, this collection of the discarded and forgotten. He taught them to read using newspapers found in trash cans, to count using bottle caps and buttons, to fight using lessons learned in Korean foxholes where survival was measured in heartbeats. It was Tommy who found her first. He'd been searching for scrap metal to trade for food when he saw the figure collapsed beside the pier, a woman in a torn dress, her face turned away from the weak morning sun, her breathing shallow and ragged. At first, he thought she might be dead. Then he saw her fingers moving, tracing letters in the dirt over and over. Trutich. Rook. Tommy's voice echoed through the theater basement, urgent and afraid. "There's a lady. She's hurt real bad." Rook had carried wounded soldiers through rice paddies and mountain passes, but something about this woman's stillness unnerved him. The brand on her cheek was still fresh, the flesh angry and swollen, but it was her eyes that made him pause. Even unconscious, even broken, they held a fire that reminded him of his mother's eyes when she'd faced down the men who tried to evict them from their sharecropper shack in Alabama. He lifted her carefully, noting how little she weighed, how her hands were calloused from honest work, how she clutched a small notebook even in unconsciousness. In the theater basement, he laid her on the old couch that served as his bed, covered her with the army blanket that had followed him home from Korea. For 3 days, she drifted between sleep and something deeper. The children took turns watching her, bringing water in tin cups, whispering questions Rook couldn't answer. Who was she? What had happened to her face? Why did she sometimes cry in her sleep? On the 4th morning, she opened her eyes and found Mina sitting beside her, carefully cleaning the wound with a damp cloth. "You're safe," Mina said in her matter-of-fact way. "Rook says you're safe now." Alma tried to speak, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Where?" "You're with us," came a voice from across the room. Alma turned to see a tall black man with gentle eyes and scars on his hands that spoke of battles she couldn't imagine. "You're with family now." He handed her a cup of water, waited while she drank, then sat down where she could see him without having to turn her branded cheek away from the light. "My name is Rook Walker," he said, "and you don't have to tell me what happened. The mark tells enough of that story. But if you want to tell me your name, I'd be honored to know it." "Alma," she whispered. "Alma Bronstein." "Well, Alma Bronstein," Rook said, his voice carrying the weight of understanding that only comes from surviving the unsurvivable. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need. No questions, no judgment. No payment required except maybe helping me keep these three from burning the place down." For the first time in 4 days, Alma almost smiled. Part 4. Learning to breathe again, 3,500 characters. Silence became Alma's first language in the theater basement. Not the oppressive silence of fear that had choked her neighborhood when Crowley's name was spoken, but a different kind. The healing quiet of a place where words weren't necessary for understanding. She spent her first weeks listening to the sound of Rook's boots on the concrete floor as he paced during his nightmares, to Mina's soft humming while she mended clothes with stitches Alma recognized as her own handiwork. The girl had been watching her work through the shop window for months, to Tommy's angry muttering as he practiced reading, his Irish accent making the English words sound like prayers and curses combined, to Rosa's whispered Spanish lullabies that spoke of mountains and mothers she'd left behind. The children didn't ask about her face. Children, Alma realized, had a different relationship with scars than adults did. To them, marks were just marks, proof that you'd survived something, like Tommy's crooked finger from a badly healed break, or the long scar across Rook's forearm that he'd gotten pulling Mina from a fire in the building where they'd first met. But adults saw the L branded on her cheek and immediately began calculating. What had she done to deserve it? How much trouble might she bring to their door? Was associating with her worth the risk? Rook never asked those questions. He simply accepted her presence the way he'd accepted the children, as someone who needed shelter from a world that had forgotten how to be kind. On her 10th day in the basement, Alma finally spoke more than single words. "I used to be a seamstress," she said as she watched Mina struggling with a torn dress. "I could teach you the proper way." Mina's face lit up like Christmas morning. For the next 2 hours, Alma guided the girl's small fingers, showing her how to make stitches so tiny they were nearly invisible, how to reinforce fabric without bunching it, how to turn a tear into something that looked intentional. "You make it look like magic," Mina breathed, running her finger along a seam that had been ragged moments before. "It's not magic," Alma said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It's just patience, and practice, and believing that broken things can be made beautiful again." That night, Tommy approached her with a newspaper, pointing to words he couldn't decipher. By lamplight, Alma read him stories about baseball games and city council meetings, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. Rosa curled up beside them, following along with pictures she couldn't read but stories she somehow understood. Rook watched from across the room, whittling a piece of wood into what would become a toy horse for Rosa. "You're good with them," he said quietly. "They're good with me," Alma replied. "They don't see a marked woman. They just see someone who can teach them things." "What do you see when you look at them?" Alma considered this, watching as Tommy sounded out a particularly difficult word, his face scrunched in concentration. "I see what I used to be, before I learned that speaking truth could get you branded like cattle." "And what do you see when you look at yourself?" This question hung in the air for a long moment. Alma's hand unconsciously moved to her cheek, fingers tracing the raised flesh that spelled out her supposed shame. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I'm starting to think it's not what other people told me I should see." As autumn turned toward winter, Alma found herself settling into rhythms she'd never known existed. She helped Rook maintain their hidden home, teaching the children skills that went beyond survival: how to cook simple meals from scraps, how to keep clothes clean without proper washing facilities, how to make art from discarded materials they found in the theater's storage rooms. But most importantly, she was learning something she'd lost the day they'd branded her: how to exist without fear. In the basement sanctuary, surrounded by other people the world had discarded, Alma began to remember who she'd been before Crowley's iron had tried to rewrite her story on her flesh. The scar was still there, would always be there. But increasingly, She found herself forgetting to hide it when she spoke. Part 5. When the Past Finds You, 3,500 characters. Winter in Brooklyn hit like a judgment, turning the theater basement from sanctuary into survival test. The old heating system groaned and wheezed, providing just enough warmth to keep them alive but not enough for comfort. Rook had found work at the docks, backbreaking labor that paid barely enough to keep them fed. But it meant leaving Alma alone with the children for long hours. She'd grown protective of them in ways that surprised her. When Mina developed a cough that rattled in her small chest, Alma sat up 3 nights running, making steam from hot water and herbs she'd begged from the Chinese herbalist on Mott Street. When Tommy came home with a black eye from fighting older boys who'd called him names, she taught him how to wrap his knuckles and where to aim his punches for maximum effect. Violence isn't the answer, she told him as she demonstrated the proper way to throw a right hook. But sometimes it's the only language bullies understand. For 3 months, they lived in relative peace. The world above might have been chaos, but in their underground refuge, they'd created something approaching family. Alma even began to hope that perhaps she could build a new life from the ashes of her old one. Then Officer Murphy found them. It was a Tuesday in February when Alma returned from selling small sewing repairs at the market to find Murphy standing in their basement, his police cap in his hands, his young face tight with something between guilt and terror. "Miss Bronstein," he said, his Irish accent thick with emotion. "I've been looking for you for months." Rook stepped forward, placing himself between Murphy and the children. "You need to leave. Now." "I can't," Murphy said, never taking his eyes off Alma. "There's something you need to know. About Inspector Crowley. About what's been happening since that day." Alma's hand moved instinctively to her cheek. "What about it?" Murphy pulled a folded newspaper from his coat. The headline made Alma's breath catch: "Police Inspector under investigation for corruption charges." "It took time," Murphy said, "but some of us couldn't forget what we saw that day. Couldn't forget that you might have been telling the truth. We started investigating quietly. Found others willing to talk. Found evidence." "Why are you telling me this?" Alma asked, though part of her already knew. "Because he knows we're closing in. And he knows you're the one who started it all. He's been sending men to look for you, Miss Bronstein. Dangerous men. Not cops, men who do work that cops can't be seen doing." As if summoned by his words, they heard footsteps on the theater's main floor above them. Heavy boots moving with purpose. "Shit," Rook breathed, grabbing the rifle he kept hidden behind the old stage curtains. "Kids, get to the back room. Now." But there wasn't time. The basement door exploded inward, and 3 men poured down the stairs. They weren't wearing badges. These were Crowley's private contractors, the kind of men who solved problems by making them disappear. The first one was built like a bull, with hands that had clearly done this kind of work before. He smiled when he saw Alma, a cold expression that made her skin crawl. Well, the famous Miss Bronstein. Inspector Crowley sends his regards." Rook stepped forward, rifle raised. "You're not welcome here." "Wasn't talking to you, boy," the man sneered. "Though I suppose we'll have to do something about witnesses." That's when little Rosa screamed. The second man had grabbed her while everyone's attention was on the leader, lifting the 6-year-old like she weighed nothing. His knife glinted in the dim basement light, pressed just close enough to her throat to draw a thin line of blood. "Now," the leader continued conversationally, "this can go easy or hard. Miss Bronstein comes with us quietly, and maybe we let the rest of you live. Make trouble, and the little girl learns what sharp things can do." Alma felt the familiar taste of fear in her mouth, the same metallic terror she'd experienced in that alley months ago. But this time, it wasn't just her life at stake. "Let her go," Alma said, stepping forward. "I'll come with you. Just don't hurt the children." "Alma, no," Rook said, but she was already moving. "It's okay," she said, though her voice shook. "This was always going to happen. I just hoped we'd have more time." But as she reached the stairs, Murphy stepped forward. "Actually," he said, pulling out his service revolver, "I think there's been a change of plans." Part 6. The choice not to run, 3,500 characters. What happened next unfolded like a deadly dance in the cramped basement. Murphy's gun swung toward the man holding Rosa, but the leader was faster than his bulk suggested. He lunged forward, knocking the young officer against the concrete wall with a sickening crack. Rook's rifle barked once, twice. The third man dropped, clutching his shoulder. But in the chaos, the leader had reached Alma, his meaty hand wrapping around her throat. "Enough!" he roared. "Everyone stops moving, or I crush her windpipe right here." The basement fell silent except for Rosa's quiet sobbing and Murphy's labored breathing as he struggled to get back to his feet. Alma could feel the man's fingers tightening, could smell the stale tobacco on his breath, could see her reflection in his cold eyes. But something had changed in her during those months in the theater basement. The woman who had collapsed by the pier, broken and branded, was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned that survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about choosing what you were willing to fight for. "You know what's funny?" Alma said, her voice steady despite the hand around her throat. "When Crowley branded me, he thought he was marking me as a liar. But all he really did was give me permanent proof of what he's capable of." The man's grip tightened. "Shut up. Every person who sees this scar," Alma continued, reaching up to trace the L on her cheek, "gets to wonder what kind of man burns letters into women's faces. What kind of system protects men like that? What kind of neighborhood stays silent while it happens?" I said shut up, but Alma wasn't done. In her peripheral vision, she could see Rook slowly repositioning himself, see Tommy creeping along the wall with something heavy in his hands, see Mina carefully moving Rosa away from the man with the knife. "You can kill me," Alma said. "Crowley probably wants you to. But you can't kill what I represent. You can't brand silence onto every woman who's been hurt, every family that's been threatened, every person who knows the truth about what he's done." The leader's face was red with rage. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing. You're a marked woman in a basement with a bunch of strays. Nobody cares about you. Nobody's coming to save you." That's when Alma smiled. Not the broken, fearful expression she'd worn for months, but something fierce and bright and utterly unafraid. "You're right," she said. "Nobody's coming to save me, because I don't need saving anymore." She drove her elbow backward into his solar plexus just as Rook had taught her, using his grip on her throat as leverage. The man doubled over, gasping, and Tommy's improvised club, a heavy piece of theater equipment, connected with his skull. The knife-wielding man made a desperate lunge toward Rosa, but Mina was ready with a handful of the pepper she'd been grinding for dinner. His screams echoed off the basement walls as he clawed at his burning eyes. Within minutes, it was over. 2 men unconscious, 1 temporarily blinded, and Murphy shakily getting to his feet with his handcuffs already out. "Well," he said, spitting blood from a split lip, "that went better than I expected." As they waited for Murphy's backup to arrive, honest cops he trusted, he assured them. Alma sat with the children, checking them for injuries, whispering reassurances. But her mind was elsewhere, calculating, planning. "We can't stay here," Rook said quietly. "They'll send more. Probably not tonight, but soon." "I know." Alma looked around the basement that had been her sanctuary, her healing place, her home. "But I'm tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of letting them make me feel like I'm the one who did something wrong." "What are you thinking?" Alma stood, walking to the small mirror they'd hung near the wash basin. For the first time in months, she looked directly at her reflection, studying the scar that had been meant to shame her. "I'm thinking it's time to go home. Back to the neighborhood?" "Alma, that's suicide." "No," she said, turning back to face them. "Staying hidden is suicide. Letting them win by default is suicide. That scar on my face, it's not just my shame anymore. It's their crime, written in flesh for everyone to see." She knelt beside Rosa, who was still shaking from her ordeal. "What do you do when someone tries to hurt you?" "Fight back," Rosa whispered in her careful English. "And what do you do when they try to make you ashamed of fighting back?" The little girl looked up at her with eyes far too old for her 6 years. Fight harder. Alma nodded. Fight smarter. Fight louder. Fight until everyone can see who the real monsters are. Murphy had been listening from across the room. If you go back there, I can't protect you. Not officially. Crowley still has too many friends in the department. I'm not asking for official protection, Alma said. I'm asking for the truth to finally have a chance to be heard. And I think there are more people ready to listen than Crowley realizes. Rook shook his head, but there was admiration in his voice. You're planning something crazy, aren't you? Alma's smile was sharp as broken glass. I'm planning to stop being a victim. There's a difference. By dawn, they had packed what little they owned and were walking west, away from the river, toward the neighborhood that had cast Alma out. This time, she wasn't running from anything. She was running toward everything she'd been too afraid to face. Part 7. Return to the scene of the crime, 3,500 characters. The Lower East Side looked smaller than Alma remembered. The tenements seemed to lean inward, as if the neighborhood itself was trying to hide from the morning sun. But as she walked down Hester Street with Rook beside her and the children trailing behind like a ragtag parade, she realized it wasn't the buildings that had changed. It was her. The old Alma would have kept her head down, would have tried to make herself invisible, would have hurried past the places where people might recognize her. This Alma walked with her shoulders back and her scarred cheek turned toward the light, daring anyone to look away. They found shelter in an abandoned warehouse near the East River. Not hiding this time, but establishing a base of operations. Rook had connections from his dock work. Men who owed him favors and women who remembered his kindness when their own husbands had returned broken from Korea. Within days, they had mattresses, blankets, and enough food to keep the children fed. But Alma wasn't interested in just surviving. She was planning. Her first target was Mrs. Goldberg, the woman who had brought her water the day she was branded but hadn't had the courage to do more. Alma found her in the same spot where she'd always done her shopping, haggling with the butcher over the price of chicken. "Hello, Mrs. Goldberg." The older woman turned, and her face went white when she saw the scar. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mrs. Goldberg's eyes filled with tears. "Alma, child, what are you doing here? It's not safe." "It's never been safe," Alma replied. "That's why I'm here." She spent 20 minutes talking with Mrs. Goldberg, not asking for anything, just listening. The woman was afraid of Crowley, afraid of his men, afraid of what might happen to her shop if she was seen talking to the wrong people. But she was also angry. Angry at herself for her silence. Angry at a system that protected monsters. Angry at living in fear. "There are others," Mrs. Goldberg whispered as they parted. "Others who remember what really happened that day. Others who are tired of being afraid." The next day, Alma visited the young mother whose daughter had been assaulted by one of Crowley's men. The day after that, she talked to the shopkeeper whose store had been vandalized when he refused to pay protection money. One by one, she began collecting stories, not evidence for a courtroom, but truth for the court of public opinion. It was on her 4th day back in the neighborhood that she encountered her first real test. She was walking past the alley where she'd been branded when a voice called out behind her. "Well, well, look what crawled back." She turned to see Detective Sullivan, one of Crowley's loyal supporters, flanked by 2 other officers she didn't recognize. Sullivan was a thin man with mean eyes and the kind of smile that never reached above his mustache. "Miss Bronstein," he said with mock politeness, "I heard you were back in the neighborhood. Causing trouble again, I'd imagine." A small crowd was beginning to gather, the same mix of curiosity and fear that had watched her branding months before. But this time, Alma didn't try to make herself small. "I'm not causing trouble, Detective Sullivan," she said clearly, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I'm just living my life." "Is that against the law now?" "Depends on what kind of life you're planning to live. We hear you've been filling people's heads with lies again." "I've been telling the truth." "If that sounds like lies to you, maybe you should ask yourself why." Sullivan's face darkened. "You want to be careful, Miss Bronstein. Very careful. Accidents can happen to people who don't know their place." The crowd was growing larger, and Alma could see familiar faces among them. Mrs. Goldberg was there, wringing her hands but not walking away. The young mother was standing in her doorway, her child peeking out from behind her skirts. Even old Mr. Rosenstein had emerged from his bakery, flour still dusting his apron. "You know what I think, detective?" Alma said, stepping closer to Sullivan. "I think you're afraid. I think all of you are afraid. Because you know that if enough people start talking, if enough people start asking questions, your whole system falls apart." "Is that a threat?" Alma smiled, and for the first time since her branding, it was a smile without fear. "It's a promise, but not from me, from them." She gestured to the crowd that had gathered, to the faces watching from windows, to the people who had been silent for so long they'd forgotten they had voices. "You can intimidate one woman," Alma continued. "You can brand her, beat her, try to make her disappear. But you can't brand all of us. You can't silence everyone who knows what you really are." Sullivan's hand moved to his nightstick, but he seemed to suddenly realize how many people were watching. In the old days, that wouldn't have mattered. In the old days, the crowd would have dispersed at the first sign of trouble. But today was different. Today they stayed. "This isn't over," Sullivan muttered. "You're right," Alma said. "It's just beginning." Part 8. The Awakening, 3,500 characters. Word spread through the Lower East Side like fire through dry leaves. The marked woman was back, and she wasn't hiding anymore. More importantly, she wasn't backing down. That evening, as Alma sat with the children in their warehouse home, she heard a soft knock at the door. Rook answered it cautiously, his hand near the knife he always carried, but relaxed when he saw who it was. Sarah Goldstein stood in the doorway, the same young woman who had worked at the dress shop with bruises she tried to hide. But now she looked different. Her shoulders were straight, her chin was up, and there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Miss Bronstein," she said quietly, "I heard what happened today, with Detective Sullivan." "Come in, child," Alma said, gesturing to one of the crates they used as chairs. "What's on your mind?" Sarah sat down, her hands trembling slightly. "I wanted to thank you for what you said about not being able to silence everyone. I only spoke the truth." "But that's just it," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "Nobody's been speaking truth around here for so long. I'd almost forgotten what it sounded like." She paused, took a deep breath. "I want to tell you what really happened to me. What Inspector Crowley's nephew did to me in the back room of my uncle's shop." Alma listened as Sarah told her story. Not just the assault, but the aftermath. The threats if she spoke up. The bribes offered to her family to keep quiet. The way the neighborhood had closed ranks around the lie that she had been asking for it by working late alone. "I've been carrying this shame for 2 years," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "But seeing you today, seeing that scar on your face that you're not trying to hide anymore, I realized the shame was never mine to carry." By the end of the week, there were others. Mrs. Kowalski came to tell Alma about the protection money that had bankrupted her husband's cobbler shop. A young man named David shared how Crowley's men had beaten him unconscious for refusing to lie about witnessing a robbery. An elderly woman named Mrs. Chan spoke through her grandson about the drugs that Crowley's operation had sold to her son, leading to his overdose. Each story was different, but they all had the same ending. Silence, fear, and the gradual acceptance that this was just how things were in their neighborhood. But something was changing. Alma could feel it in the way people looked at her now, not with pity or disgust, but with something approaching hope. She could see it in the way conversations didn't stop when she approached, the way mothers no longer pulled their children away from her path. The real turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening. Alma was walking back from the market when she heard shouting from an alley behind Delancey Street. She recognized the voice. It was Tommy, one of the boys from her makeshift family. She rounded the corner to find him facing off against 3 older boys, at least 16 years old to his 12. His nose was bleeding, his shirt was torn, but he was still standing. "Just because she's got a mark don't mean she's a liar," Tommy was saying, his fists raised despite being outnumbered. "You don't know nothing about her." "Tommy," Alma called out, stepping into the alley. The older boys turned, and she could see the calculation in their eyes. Was she worth the trouble? But before anyone could move, other figures appeared at both ends of the alley. Mrs. Goldberg with a rolling pin in her hands. Sarah Goldstein with two of her cousins. Mr. Rosenstein with his son. Mrs. Kowalski with a heavy wooden spoon that looked like it could crack skulls. "Is there a problem here?" Mrs. Goldberg asked sweetly, as if she were inquiring about the weather. The older boys looked around, suddenly realizing they were vastly outnumbered by people who were no longer afraid to be seen standing together. "No problem," one of them muttered, and they slunk away into the rain. As the group dispersed, Mrs. Goldberg approached Alma. "You know what this means, don't you?" she said quietly. "What?" "It means Crowley can't pretend anymore that you're just one crazy woman making trouble. It means people are listening. And when people start listening—" She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. That night, Alma couldn't sleep. She stood at the warehouse window, looking out at the lights of the neighborhood she'd been born in, the place that had cast her out and was now slowly, cautiously, welcoming her back. Rook joined her at the window. "You're scared," he said. It wasn't a question. "Terrified," she admitted. "When it was just me, the worst they could do was kill me. But now—" She gestured toward the corner where the children were sleeping. "Now I have people depending on me. People who believe in what we're doing." Second thoughts. Alma touched her scarred cheek, thinking about all the stories she'd heard over the past week. All the pain that had been suffered in silence. All the fear that had kept good people trapped. "No," she said firmly. "No second thoughts. But I know what's coming next. Crowley won't be able to ignore this much longer. And when he moves against us, it won't be subtle. Then we'd better be ready." Alma nodded, still looking out at the neighborhood lights. Tomorrow, she would start teaching the women who came to her how to fight back. Not just with words, but with their hands, their voices, their refusal to be victims anymore. Tomorrow, the real war would begin. Part 9. The final stand, 3,500 characters, came sooner than Alma expected. She was teaching a group of women basic self-defense in the warehouse, how to break free from a grab, where to hit to cause maximum damage, how to use everyday objects as weapons. When little Rosa came running in, her eyes wide with terror. "Men coming," she gasped in her broken English. Many men, with Inspector. Through the grimy warehouse windows, Alma could see them approaching. Crowley himself, flanked by a dozen officers and twice as many hired thugs. This wasn't a subtle intimidation attempt. This was an ending. "Everyone out the back," Alma ordered, but Mrs. Goldberg shook her head. "No more running," the older woman said firmly. "You taught us that." One by one, the women nodded. Sarah Goldstein picked up a length of pipe from the warehouse floor. Mrs. Kowalski tested the weight of a brick in her hand. Even timid Mrs. Chen's daughter-in-law, who rarely spoke above a whisper, stood with her jaw set and her fists clenched. "This is madness," Rook said, checking his rifle. "We can't fight that many." "We're not fighting alone," Alma replied, and she was right. The warehouse doors burst open, and Crowley strode in like he owned the place, which, in his mind, he probably did. He was a big man gone to fat. His police uniform stretched tight across his belly, his small eyes scanning the group with contempt. "Alma Bronstein," he said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "I should have killed you the day I marked you." "Maybe you should have," Alma replied, stepping forward. "But you didn't. And now look what's happened." Behind Crowley, his men spread out, trying to flank the group. But they found their way blocked by more people streaming into the warehouse. Neighbors, shopkeepers, even some of the younger officers who had grown sick of Crowley's corruption. Officer Murphy was among them, his service revolver drawn but pointed at Crowley instead of at Alma. "Inspector," Murphy said formally, "you're under arrest for corruption, assault, and conspiracy." Crowley laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think these people matter? You think their word means anything against mine?" "Actually," came a new voice from the warehouse entrance, "I think it does." A man in an expensive suit stepped into the light. Federal Marshal, Alma realized from his badge. flanked by FBI agents. "Inspector Crowley, I'm Marshall Davidson. We've been investigating your activities for some time now. Thanks to testimony from Officer Murphy and others, we have enough evidence to put you away for a very long time." For the first time since Alma had known him, Crowley looked uncertain. His eyes darted around the warehouse, calculating odds, looking for escape routes. "This is a setup," he snarled. "These people are lying. They're criminals. Degenerates dash." "Actually," Alma interrupted, stepping closer. "We're citizens. Citizens who got tired of being afraid." She was close enough now to see the sweat on his forehead, close enough to smell the desperation on him. "You tried to silence me by marking me as a liar," she continued, her voice carrying clearly through the warehouse. "But every person here knows what really happened that day. They know who the real liar is." Crowley's hand moved toward his gun, but he was surrounded now, federal agents, honest cops, and 24 neighborhood residents who had finally found their courage. "You know what your mistake was?" Alma asked, reaching up to touch the scar on her cheek one final time. "You thought shame was something you could give to other people. You thought if you marked me, everyone would see your version of the truth." She smiled then, the same fearless smile that had carried her through months of healing and weeks of building this moment. "But shame doesn't work that way. Shame only has power if you accept it. And I stopped accepting yours a long time ago." The fight, when it came, was brief and brutal. Some of Crowley's hired men tried to run. Others tried to fight their way out. But they were outnumbered, outmanned, and fighting people who had everything to lose and nothing left to fear. When the dust settled, Crowley was on his knees in handcuffs, his empire crumbling around him. Several of his men were dead or wounded. The others were in custody. As the federal agents led Crowley away, he turned back to Alma one last time. "This isn't over," he said. "There will always be others like me." "You're right," Alma replied. "But there will also always be people like us. People who refuse to stay silent. People who turn their scars into strength." She looked around the warehouse at the faces surrounding her, Rook and the children who had become her family, the women who had found their voices, the neighbors who had rediscovered their courage. "And we'll be ready for them." Part 10, New Beginnings, 3,500 characters. 6 months after Crowley's arrest, the warehouse had been transformed into something nobody could have imagined. What had started as a desperate hiding place had become the heart of a neighborhood renaissance. The federal investigation had uncovered corruption that reached far beyond one inspector. Dozens of officers were fired or imprisoned. City officials lost their jobs. The protection rackets that had strangled local businesses for years crumbled overnight. But more importantly, something had awakened in the people of the Lower East Side. A sense that they had power, that their voices mattered, that they didn't have to accept injustice as the price of survival. Alma stood in what they now called the community center, watching as Mrs. Goldberg taught a literacy class to women who had never learned to read. In the corner, Rook was showing teenagers from the neighborhood how to repair bicycles, a skill that had led to jobs for several young men who had been headed toward trouble. The children who had become her family were thriving. Mina had become the center's unofficial nurse, treating scraped knees and bruised hearts with equal skill. Tommy was learning carpentry from Mr. Rosenstein, his anger channeled into building things instead of breaking them. And little Rosa, now speaking fluent English alongside her Spanish, served as translator for the growing number of Puerto Rican families moving into the neighborhood. But it was the wall that meant the most to Alma. They had painted it themselves, dozens of hands contributing to a mural that told the story of their community's transformation. There were images of the old neighborhood. Dark alleys, fearful faces, hands pressed over mouths in enforced silence. But alongside them were new images. Women standing together, children playing safely in the streets, neighbors helping neighbors, and at the center of it all, a rising sun painted in brilliant gold. Carved into the wooden frame around the mural were symbols that had been suggested by community members. Mrs. Chun had contributed a Chinese character meaning courage. The Irish families had added a Celtic knot representing unity. The Jewish residents had suggested a Hebrew phrase meaning justice, Justice you shall pursue. And scattered throughout were small suns. Rosa's idea, she said, because Alma taught us that morning always comes. The scar on Alma's face was still there, would always be there. But now when children asked about it, she had a different answer than the one she'd given in those first dark months. This mark, she would tell them, is a reminder, not of shame, but of strength. Not of what was done to me, but of what I chose to do about it. On this particular evening, as the community center began to empty out, Alma found herself standing alone in front of the mural. She traced one finger along the painted sun, remembering the woman who had collapsed by the East River Pier all those months ago, broken and branded and convinced her life was over. Thinking deep thoughts? Rook's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him approaching with 2 cups of coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute they'd survived on for so long. One of the benefits of living in a neighborhood where businesses were thriving again instead of being bled dry by corrupt cops. Just remembering, she said, accepting the cup gratefully. Good memories or bad ones? Alma considered this. Both, I think. The bad ones remind me why this matters. The good ones remind me that it was worth it. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the late afternoon light filter through the warehouse windows. Outside, they could hear the sounds of a neighborhood at peace. Children playing, vendors calling out their wares, neighbors chatting on stoops without fear of who might be listening. There's something I've been meaning to ask you, Rook said eventually. What's that? That day you decided to come back here, to face Crowley instead of running. What made you so sure it would work? Alma smiled, thinking of all the faces that had surrounded her in that final confrontation. All the voices that had finally found the courage to speak truth. I wasn't sure it would work, she admitted, but I was sure that staying silent would definitely fail. And I'd learned something important during those months in the theater basement. What? That healing isn't about forgetting what hurt you. It's about choosing what you do with that hurt. You can let it make you smaller, or you can let it make you stronger. You can use it to hide, or you can use it to help others find their way out of hiding. She gestured toward the mural, toward the symbols of hope and renewal that now decorated their community space. Crowley thought that scar would be the end of my story, but it turned out to be just the beginning. As if summoned by her words, the children came running in from their after-school adventures, Mina with her arms full of books from the library, Tommy with wood shavings in his hair from his carpentry lessons, Rosa with a handful of flowers she'd picked for the dinner table. Alma, Rosa called out in her clear, confident voice. Come see what we made. They had been working on a project in secret for weeks, a small wooden sign for the front of the community center. As they unveiled it with great ceremony, Alma felt tears prick at her eyes. The sign was simple, elegant, carved with the careful precision that Tommy had learned from Mr. Rosenstein. It read, Sunrise Community Center, where every voice matters. Below the words, they had carved a small sun. And below that, in letters so tiny you had to look closely to see them, Rosa had added one final message. For Alma, who taught us that morning always comes. Alma knelt down and pulled all 3 children into a fierce hug, feeling Rook's hand settle gently on her shoulder. Outside, the real sun was setting over Brooklyn, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. But inside the community center, surrounded by the family she had chosen and the community she had helped to heal, Alma Bronstein knew that for her, it would always be sunrise.